It's Thursday, September 18th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Here's a quote for you. International cooperation is straining under pressures unseen in our lifetimes. So said UN Secretary-General António Guterres ahead of next week's UN General Assembly. Today on the show, well, we talk about those pressures and what the UN might be able to do about them. I mean, or not. Welcome to the show, folks. This is The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. I've got Lucian Ashworth is back here, a MUN poli-sci prof, international relations expert, and Justin Fantauzzo is back, MUN history professor and expert on the modern Middle East. It's been a while, gentlemen. Thanks for coming back in.
Yeah.
Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, Luke, Adam, nice to see you guys.
Yeah.
All right. I will play the UN Secretary-General first. We've got 3 minutes. This is him on Tuesday, just talking about where we're at in next week. So take a listen.
Leaders are making their way to New York for the UN's 80th anniversary and the high-level week of the General Assembly. Some call it the World Cup of diplomacy. But this cannot be about scoring points. It must be about solving problems. There is too much at stake. We are gathering in turbulent, even uncharted waters. Geopolitical divides widening, conflicts raging, impunity escalating, our planet overeating, new technologies racing ahead without guardrails, inequalities widening by the hour, and international cooperation is straining under pressures unseen in our lifetimes. But next week, every country will be here, including nearly 150 heads of state and government. And this is an opportunity we cannot miss. UN Week offers every possibility for dialogue and mediation, every opportunity for forging solutions. Thousands of leaders' meetings will take place, and I will hold over 150 bilateral meetings myself, and I will use every one of them to press leaders to contact each other, to speak directly with each other, to bridge divides, to reduce risks, to find solutions, to get serious. People are demanding answers and action, actions that match the gravity of the challenges our world faces, actions that meet the expectations of all those on the outside looking in. Let this be a week of solutions for peace in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan and beyond, and for a pathway for a just, lasting peace in the Middle East based on a two-state solution. For climate, with countries stepping up with ambitious new national climate action plans that keep 1.5 degree limit alive. For responsible innovation, as we launch the global dialogue on AI governance to put humanity at the center of technological change with every country at the table. For women and girls, with concrete plans for equality, as we mark the 30th anniversary of the landmark Beijing Conference. For financing development, at the first of its kind biennial summit, bringing together leaders of international financial institutions and heads of state, and focused on implementing commitments on financing the Sustainable Development Goals. For a stronger, united nations, by backing our UN 80 initiative to equip the UN for a world that no longer looks like 1945 or even last year. The list is long because the needs are great. Our times demand more than posturing and promises. They demand that leaders make progress and follow through. To honor the Charter, pursue peace, advance sustainable development, ensure human rights, and confront global challenges together. The United Nations is the place. Next week is the time, and leaders must get serious and deliver.
So there, from Tuesday of this week, UN Secretary-General António Guterres. I mean, he kind of has to say that, right? When you're the UN Secretary-General, you can't come out and say, well, you know, nothing's going to work. Why get together? Why talk about anything? There is success. Progress can be made with diplomacy. It does get made with diplomacy. But with everything he just laid out there, like looking ahead to next week, all world leaders coming together, just for a brief opener, what are your guys' thoughts on just where we are right now and where progress might be able to be made or not?
Well, Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's a remarkably optimistic speech by Guterres.
Yeah.
And you can kind of detect, if you read between the lines a little bit, the frustration he's expressing in that speech about, he says the need to get serious a couple of times.
Yeah.
The need to kind of move beyond promises, the need to move beyond posturing towards action. He cuts the figure of a frustrated head of an organization that has been a frustrating organization, I think, both to deal with and in terms of its ability to solve major world problems, especially the last 10 years. An organization that's struggled to do those kinds of things, not only because it sometimes doesn't have the resources to, or it doesn't have the teeth to enforce the kinds of changes that people think or want it to be able to make, but an organization that is, at least since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, if not earlier, the United States is not the only power, as we know, globally, that's kind of pushed back against the authority, the decision-making capacity, the even at times the reason for the existence of some of these international organizations. As a collective international political body, it's hard to do things when the collective can't agree on either what they are supposed to do or whether they should even be doing anything at all. And so it's remarkably optimistic. I hope he's right. I'm less optimistic. I would say I'm a little pessimistic that kind of change can be hammered out over a week. But as you said, Adam, he's got to say it.
Yeah.
He's got to set the tone, right?
Yeah, 100%. Luke?
Yeah, well, it's a full agenda. We can say that. Yeah, I think, just running off a point that Justin made there about the need for a kind of consensus amongst the members of the organization really makes a key point. Because, it's very easy to say, oh, well, this is optimistic. The UN doesn't have any teeth, doesn't have any power. Well, it's not totally true. The UN has the power to bring diplomats together, and it has the power to help construct these kind of coalitions to get things done. But the problem is not necessarily with the UN, and it comes back to, I think, Justin's point, which I think was spot on. It's just the problem is the divisions between the member states. Because, when we're talking about the UN, we're not just talking about the Secretariat, we're not talking about the offices in New York. What we're talking about is it's a coalition of all the member states, which is most of the states in the world. And if you can't pull a coalition together, and for that you need particularly the stronger states to do that, you've got trouble. But the trouble isn't with the UN. The trouble's with the member states.
And I think it's worth remembering as well, he points this out. He references 1945 and the founding of the UN Charter in the aftermath of the Second World War. As the historian here, thinking long term, 80 years into this international political project, it is still in a lot of ways in its infancy. That's hard to kind of wrap our heads around, but this global international political project is still kind of in chapter 1, of its book. Nothing like this really existed prior to it, obviously with the exception of a kind of a bit of a failure to launch with the League of Nations.
Yeah, that's Woodrow Wilson, right?
Yeah, between 1919 and 1939, that had similar problems. Certain states not buying in, certain states not joining.
I would add to that, going back to the League, the whole point was when the League was founded in 1919, no one actually quite knew what it would do and in fact, the coalition of people who supported the League, each one of them saw it differently. And in some respects, it was a bit different in 1945, but not that much different. There was still a sense, of exactly how is this going to work. So it's done pretty well considering.
So this is our jumping off point, and we'll continue to drill down. So we'll work through a lot of those points that the Secretary-General mentioned. One of the things that came up, he talked about climate change. So joining us on the line here, Tzeporah Berman, a Canadian, obviously been on the show before, environmental campaigner who also founded the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative in 2020. Thank you for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me.
So I was looking at a piece in The Guardian, and it says the part that stood out for me is the quote that every company wants to produce the last barrel of sold when it comes to oil. And this is something that in Newfoundland and Labrador we've heard about. It's this bit of as long as people are buying oil, it should come from here. And there's been comments on it being more ethical. There's been comments on it being less carbon intensive. And if I were to, pardon the pun here, drill down into that a little bit, they mean it on the production side, but there's a term that's been floated around, this lower carbon type oil. I would love to start with your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, we already have enough oil, gas, and coal on the surface of the planet or under production that if we use it, we cannot meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It will take us well past 2 degrees. The science is really clear, and no new projects fit, whether they're LNG, oil, gas, coal. They don't fit. I think equally as important, we have enough. We have enough fossil fuels to use during the transition, and renewables are now cheaper. But the problem is, even though every country knows we need to use less fossil fuels, we need to produce less fossil fuels, it's not just companies, but also countries. Everyone's telling us, look, as long as they're producing it, we'll produce it. Or our oil's okay because it's getting cleaner. First of all, carbon capture and storage technologies are not working at scale. They've been underperforming by about 80%. That's a pipe dream, if you excuse the pun. I feel like what they've done is gone from denying climate change and delaying policy to some kind of delusion that there's a silver technological bullet that will somehow make oil clean. Oil's not clean. And this is about physics. It's about carbon. And we have too much carbon trapped in our atmosphere, and that's what's causing the fires and the floods and the extreme weather. And hurting people's health. Air pollution from fossil fuels is the single largest cause of premature death on the planet.
Yeah, and here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we just came through a summer of drought and a summer of wildfires. Folks lost homes. The conversation around climate change, there's a different feel around it here in Newfoundland and Labrador from where we just came from. And then there's this bigger discussion on oil and gas and where things are going. When we look at these big international meetings like the UN General Assembly next week and like COP30, the United Nations Climate Change Conference coming up in November, what are you looking for in both of these things for progress and are you optimistic that progress can be made given the United States' lack of involvement and pulling out from things?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, we have to make the connection between fossil fuels and the extreme weather, the droughts that you're experiencing, the floods, the fires, etc. Every new project is going to make it worse. And now we know that. The science is really clear. And so running up to Belém and at the UN climate change negotiations, we're going to be talking to countries and encouraging more countries to join the growing bloc of nations that is acknowledging that you can't transition by building more of the problem. We have to stop expanding new projects of oil, gas, and coal, and we have to manage a wind down. And the sooner that we plan for that, the sooner we'll ensure that we don't leave anyone behind, that we're putting in place the infrastructure and the job support so that we can transition. And so we have 17 countries that have joined the bloc of nations calling for a fossil fuel treaty and are participating in developing the treaty. I think we'll have another 2 this time next week at the UN General Assembly. And we think by Belém we'll have more than 20. And a lot of big treaties in our history, landmines, chemical weapons ban, they started with a group of 20 countries who had high ambition and believed in the science and wanted to create strong rules. And they actually started outside of the UN process. So while we're going to COP to encourage more countries to join, because that's where the countries will be talking about climate change, the goal really is to create a standalone diplomatic process outside of the UN that has really strong rules. It's not consensus with 190 countries. It's the countries that are willing to commit and create the new trade and tax and debt relief rules that will help them stop expanding fossil fuels.
So then for the storyline, once we get to November in Brazil for COP30. It says for the Guardian piece with you, it says Tzeporah Berman's campaign group believes COP30 will help its initiative to phase out coal and gas take shape. Like, is this is the big, because I've been in some climate meetings around storylines for COP, and like, you think you folks can get there with this storyline coming out of it in November?
I think we can, because we've been seeing really the run up to this since the Glasgow COP. The Glasgow COP was probably the first time that even the words fossil fuels were used in a climate change negotiations, which is crazy, right? 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere come from three things: oil, gas, and coal. But fossil fuels have been invisible in climate negotiations. We've been talking about reducing emissions while continuing to increase production. And so then in Dubai, again, we had another commitment from countries. Yes, we need to phase out fossil fuels, but there's no plan. There's no work plan for countries to cooperate on how to stop expansion and manage fossil fuels. And an increasing number of countries are seeing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as a work plan to help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think we have the momentum now to really change the conversation.
So where do you see Canada as being part of this in a time when they talk about it's a time to build, and there's been talk of pipelines, there's talk of energy security from Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has, as you know, and as folks who are listening know, an environmental background, obviously. Where do you see us in this, given the latest language from the Prime Minister?
Right now, Canada's on the wrong side of the fence. I mean, Canada is continuing to increase fracking, LNG, oil development to continue to build more of the problem, which I find quite shocking, given Mark Carney, in I think it was 2014, was the first governor of a bank to acknowledge the need to keep oil in the ground, that if we want to keep people safe and we want to ensure that the markets don't end up with billions of dollars worth of stranded assets, we have to stop building out fossil fuel expansion. That was in his speech in 2014. And so I think right now what we're seeing is politics, and it's not going to keep Canada safer. It's not going to ensure energy security. You know, a lot of the countries I'm talking to in Europe have been saying to us, you know what we've realized is we were dependent on gas from Putin, and now we're dependent on gas from Trump, and actually phasing out fossil fuels and putting in place electrification and renewable energy is an energy security issue for us now. Renewables are cheaper at scale. So if we want to ensure that we have a more stable economy that is not volatile, that we don't see these booms and busts that we've been living through with the price of oil, et cetera, that we have a robust energy system that can withstand extreme weather, well, that's not a fossil fuel energy system. It's a renewable energy system. And if Mark Carney and his government does believe in the science, which he has said he does, then he'll recognize that you can't transition out of something by building more of it.
Tzeporah Berman, thank you as always for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Tzeporah Berman there, a Canadian environmental campaigner who founded the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative in 2020. So, go to the guys in the studio here. Thoughts on what Ms. Berman was saying there?
Yeah, sure. I think, is coming out of this and then linking up to our earlier conversation, I think this is the issue, is that the science is known. We also know what we need to do to transition away. The problem is the lack of political will, and so this idea of coalition building often outside formal institutions like the UN. But of course, that very coalition building is what's necessary to make organizations like the UN work. So, this all makes a fair amount of sense in terms of the politics of climate change going forward.
Yeah, I think Tzeporah is making a good point as well in that, look, a lot of these movements, the beginnings of these transitions don't happen with 150, 160, 170, states all agreeing at once.
No.
Even going back to the 19th century, something like the Hague Conventions, which started to set limits on what could and could not be done on the battlefield and the kinds of weapons that could be used, the boundaries of what you could do in those conflicts. I mean, those started out largely as negotiations between Europe's great powers at the time. I mean, they weren't including everybody. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but they started out small. So I think she's absolutely right that 15, 20 nation states agreeing to a significant political economic change, not only sets the stage for what can come, but also influences other states to be a part of that as well. I mean, if you have 10, 15 of the most dominant economic players globally agreeing to a major economic, manufacturing, industrial transition, most other states are going to figure out a way to be a part of that, to fall in line, if not only out of their own economic self-interest, and not to want to be on the sidelines. So that makes total sense to me.
And if we don't limit carbon pollution, the extreme weather we're experiencing, it's getting worse now, and it will just continue to get worse unless we curtail it, and unless that transition starts to come in somewhere. Like that is science-based fact,
it is.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
so what we've seen, and just the question is, when it's wet, it's too wet, right? You get torrential rains that you've never experienced before. When it's dry, far too dry, and then you get drought conditions and dry wells and low crop yields and all of that stuff. Plus, there's a bunch of other unknowns that we don't even know what's coming.
Yeah, and I think that's the crucial thing, is that a lot of people talk about the new normal, but I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's heading towards a no normal, and that is extremely dangerous.
Yeah. And it's inconsistent, again, to kind of, I guess, bring ourselves back to that point a little bit in terms of who will buy in and who will buy not. Tzeporah brought up kind of, some of the states that have been drawn into the orbit of the Ukraine-Russia conflict and their concerns about energy security. Some states in Central and Eastern Europe, it's more of an issue than for others, or how they solve it, I should say, is different. For example, Czechia, Slovakia, they actually ended up sending a lot of oil and gas reserves that they had from originally Russia to Ukraine when the taps were shut off. But those are states that are not natural resource rich and don't have as much of an opportunity to transition to something. Or what I actually should say is, don't have the incentive to develop what they have. They don't have anything to develop. Some of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but principally the former two there, there's large liquid natural gas reserves in the Baltic Sea that they've been talking about developing exactly for that reason, for what they see as energy security for years now. So it is, as Luke said, there's a political will element to this where it's like, you can't, the Pandora's box is right in front of you. And it's a question of if you have the box or not. And if you have the key, do you open it? It's hard to say no, For some states, they don't have a choice, but for others, they do. And
you mentioned Ukraine there, Luke. I'm just looking at, and Justin too. Let me see. Reuters today. The latest headline from out of Ukraine. Ukrainian military in counteroffensive on Eastern Front, Zelensky says, right? Ukrainian troops are carrying out a counteroffensive against Russian forces on the Eastern Front, where Kyiv has reclaimed 7 settlements, President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Thursday after visiting the Donetsk region. And it goes on from there. The war's on. Obviously, this is still going on, but there's meetings around the future of Ukraine, even though this is still happening. Chrystia Freeland just announced she's stepping down from cabinet, right, and taking on a role for the rebuilding of Ukraine. So, on the international front, what's where are your thoughts on what is still happening there and the look ahead?
Yeah, well, I think we've certainly seen that kind of brief attempt by the Trump administration, and particularly using his envoy Vitkov, who hoped to develop a link to Putin to find some kind of compromise. That is now in abeyance, and we're actually getting a situation now that from the Trump administration they're actually being quite hawkish in a lot of their policy towards. But I think what's interesting is we got a kind of for all the talk of movements on the line, what we're seeing at the moment at least is not much movement. So the question then comes down, and we've discussed this in previous discussions, haven't we, Justin? Is about the question, who moves first? Who breaks first? And one of the things I have been looking at is the Russian economy. Because, of course, one of the things that's what's likely actually to lead the Russians to start climbing down from their maximalist position is whether or not the economy continues, particularly with the large number of casualties they're suffering. So they've got interest rates at 17%, which has helped them keep inflation down. Inflation is at 8.1%. And those are the Russian, and that's come down from 8.9. I follow quite a lot of the journalist. Was it Justin Rosenberg, who's based in Rosenberg, who's based in Moscow. He does digests of the Russian media, and the Russian media, which is sort of semi-government controlled, some of it very government controlled, is very worried about economic crises, recession, And so there's a deep pessimism in discussions within Russia about the Russian economy.
So then, does that come down to who can hold out longer, right? So you've got this, the war of attrition type thing happening. The stalemate's there, and it's like, okay, can Ukraine keep up? Will they have support from whether it's Canada, European allies, maybe the United States, still depending, right, on the whims of the day for decisions that get made, and then the Russian economy, and like who kind of pulls back first? Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and the whim a couple of days ago was Donald Trump for the first time finally labeling Russia as an aggressor.
Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, I think he was
right.
using it in a very specific context. I don't think he necessarily meant that the genesis of the war was Russian aggression, but referring to, he was responding to a question about Russian losses in this later counteroffensive, and called Russia the aggressor for the first time. So, there could be something of the start of a shift in how the United States approaches this. It's not just about attrition as well, and like seeing who can last the longest. It's also about who makes the worst mistake.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in the sense of the Russians, this drone incursion into Poland, and some reports as well that certain drones also had entered Romanian airspace as well in southeastern Europe.
I saw that. Yeah.
It's these kinds of mistakes that obviously have always deeply concerned, analysts and the international community since 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, that when would something happen that would draw in either a potential NATO member state or a NATO member state, such as Poland. And we saw that situation become, it's still actually playing out, but we saw that situation raise its head last week with that drone incursion, with a variety of NATO forces having to shoot down Russian drones, and then Poland invoking Article 4 of the NATO Charter, which is basically, guys, we don't feel great about what happened. We're feeling a little under duress, and it's time to convene a meeting. That usually precedes Article 5, which is the enaction of the collective security component, which has only ever been enacted once before.
For 9/11.
In the aftermath of 9/11 with the
right.
United States and Afghanistan. It's never been used since 1949 besides that.
So Article 4, right, any member country can formally bring an issue to the attention of NATO's principal decision-making body. So in this case, you're Poland, a bunch of Russian drones come in, or you're shooting them down, you're like, oh, hey, this is bad.
Yes.
Right?
That's the legal jargon for saying we're going to have a talk about that bad thing that happened.
This happened. We don't like
That's
this.
it.
And then, they meet. And that Article 5 thing is such a big deal.
Yeah, and Article 4 is really provoking the community, the NATO members, to meet to discuss whether or not to enact Article 5. I mean, that's really why it's there in sequential orders. 4 precedes 5, right?
And so what happens,
literally.
right? So 4 to 5, which does, hey, what does that mean? If all of a sudden everyone meets and they're like, actually, that was an attack by Russia and NATO, and we need, and guess what?
Yeah.
We all agreed. This is how this. So what's the mechanism then? What rolls out? What's supposed to happen if Article 5 is brought in?
So Article 5 is a little. There's some room for interpretation here. Article 5, which is the collective security component of the NATO Charter, as you just mentioned, doesn't mean that every NATO state has to engage in military action. It doesn't mean NATO as a whole is suddenly at war.
Yeah.
What it does ask NATO members to do, and this gets right back to the start of our conversation about buy-in and which states will do what when the situation arises, and promises and posturing, but action is what's necessary. What it does ask NATO states to do is to contribute to the defense of the NATO state under duress in some capacity. Doesn't necessarily mean boots on the ground. It doesn't mean tanks on the ground or planes in the air. It could be economic support. It could be sending military advisors. It could be diplomatic support. It could be further promises of collective defense if another incursion happens. So, how exactly Article 5 plays out is not as straightforward as the language suggests, but it does generally mean that the other NATO states, which includes Canada, obviously in this context, are expected to play some role in the defense of the state that has brought the conversation to the table.
And why has this been so important for so long, to have that big group there saying, if one of us is attacked, we will come to the defense in some way of them? Why has that been so important since NATO has began?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is it. I mean, this collective security is at the basis of the defense of Europe. And we can see, particularly from Russian diplomacy, they've often tried to minimize Article 5. And there have been attempts, often ham-fisted, and I don't know if this is a ham-fisted attempt on that as well, to drive a wedge to make Article 5 kind of meaningless. And I think what we've seen with the kind of the coming together here of NATO is that really hasn't worked. Mm-hmm. And there are, of course, deep divisions within NATO on how to deal with Russia. I mean, we've seen the one extreme. There's Viktor Orban, of course, and to a certain extent Fico in Slovakia, who've been willing to go to events in Russia to mark Victory Day. But events like this are a way of often bringing those outliers back in, and that's particularly important if you're getting in packages for support for Ukraine or for further sanctions against Russia. And again, because the Russian economy is not good, and in fact the recent use of drones by Ukraine to knock out installations, the refineries, has been having an effect on the price of gasoline in Russia. So, Russia wants that pressure taken off, but I think this will actually make it less likely that the Americans particularly will kind of ask to rein in the Ukrainians. Because, I mean, that's what Russia wants, the sort of people in the West to go, hang on, Ukraine, pull back. We don't want you using our weapons outside of the battlefield in Ukraine.
Well, and the Russians know as well as the Ukrainians do, and most of the international community, as far as they're aware of these kinds of issues of supply and logistics and military technology, that really without the military support, the arms shipments, the economic support of the West, principally the United States, which largely supplies Ukraine with almost all of its air defense systems as well as its short-range ballistic missiles. Without that support, Ukraine would lose this war. Yeah. There's only, it's basic numbers at some point, and the Russians have more. So there's that consideration. And then, it's a real full circle moment here. I mean, NATO's founding in 1949, as Luke said, principally to safeguard the security and stability of Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, but, with both eyes looking east towards the Soviet Union at that time as the state that was thought to be the potential aggressor. It's never invoked during the Cold War between 1945 and 1991 or so, the fall of the Soviet Union. And oddly now, in 2025, when we're on the precipice or, discussing whether or not it could be invoked, it's the successor state to the Soviet Union. It's Russia again that's proving to be the state that most Europeans are concerned about. Well, I remember, with the exception of Hungary, Slovakia, maybe, and some others.
I remember being a junior officer in the reserves, and the conversation in the late 90s was so before 9/11, post fall of the USSR. What is NATO for? And that happened, that lasted for a minute and a half, and then 9/11 happened, and then we went on from there. Yeah. Now look at where we are, back to like you said, Justin. Back to the beginning. Yeah, back to fearing the great state in Eastern Europe, and
we can also see that with the crucial membership of Finland and Sweden. Yeah, bringing in two former neutrals. Yeah, but they come in with very hawkish views about
especially
Russia,
Finland.
Especially Finland,
which is quite pro-Trump actually as well. The Finnish president, or prime minister, I should say.
But you see that kind of reinvigorating this. It is going back in some respects to the original. Collective security ideas.
Yeah, and it's really been
defense.
It's really been touch and go as well. I mean, some of our listeners might remember in 2008, Russia was in a very, very brief war with Georgia over a small area, a republic in the Caucasus,
South Ossetia,
and Abkhazia, and that was, not the start, but in more recent times, maybe the start of this Russian fear. At the time, Georgia was in negotiations with Russia or with NATO to possibly join as a member state. The president of Georgia at the time, George Saakashvili, was very close with the American political establishment. Now, ironically, he plays a major part in some respects behind the scenes in Ukraine. He was the mayor of Kyiv for a little while, actually, as well, after he had left Georgia. So a lot of this even goes back more recently to 2008 and the start of more serious negotiations by some of the Caucasian states, some of the Eastern European states around Russia's border or the former borders of the Soviet Union about NATO membership. And all of this does is just, feed the paranoia of many Russian policymakers who think that, NATO's always been pointed at them. NATO's sole goal, you talked about what is it for? They have always thought it's just to contain Russia. It's just to prevent Russia from doing what it wants in its own backyard.
Bringing up the Caucasus, of course, there's been shifting alliances there, all linked up to the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict. Armenia used to be looking to Russia.
Yeah.
But now it's fallen out with Russia. Russia has failed to protect it from Azerbaijan.
Yeah. And even Iran plays a part in that.
And even Iran. But it was the Americans then who negotiated an agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it's the US that has stepped in and is now being the honest broker, the role that Russia used to play in the region. And look, going into Georgia is we'll stop there, but Georgia is even more complicated now.
I'm Adam Walsh. This is The Signal. Today on the show, Will, we're talking, it's a tip, it's a look ahead to next week in the UN General Assembly. I started the show with a quote: "International cooperation is straining under pressures unseen in our lifetimes." That is from UN Secretary-General António Guterres. We're unpacking that today. We're talking about a lot of these big international issues. My guests, who are regulars through the year on the show for these types of shows, we've got Memorial University political science prof and international relations expert Lucian Ashworth is here. So too is Justin Fantauzzo, a MUN history professor and expert on the modern Middle East.
We wish there was a model Middle East.
Exactly. This is where we're trying to get to.
If only.
And speaking of the Middle East, here's something from this week in the news. A United Nations Commission of Inquiry in Geneva concluded on Tuesday that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza and that top Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, had incited these acts, accusations that Israel had called scandalous. The UN report cites examples of the scale of the killings, aid blockages, forced displacement, and the destruction of a fertility clinic to back up its genocide finding, adding its voice to rights groups and others who have reached the same conclusion. I will go to my guests shortly on that, but I do want to go to a guest on the line here, Heidi Janes, a PhD student with the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria. Hi, Heidi. How are you doing?
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on the show. You sent it, and I knew you from your time here in the province, and then I got an email, and you sent a note on behalf of the Canadian Association for Food Studies and the ad hoc working group on Palestine and the right to food. A letter was written, sent to the Prime Minister. Tell us, and there are some signatories from Memorial University on this. Tell us about this letter.
Right. Yeah. So there's signatories from Memorial University. There's signatories from all across Canada. And what I would say about the signatories specifically, I won't name people's names individually, but I want to say, there are many emeritus level faculty across Canadian universities, multiple Canada research chairs. Truly some of the biggest names, I think, in food-related research, including nutrition and dietetics, at our Canadian university institutions. There are also those who have worked at the level of the United Nations and have, written extensively on issues related to the international politics of food and agriculture.
It's 600 names, right? It's like 600 food, nutrition, agricultural scholars, students, workers, practititioners, and organizations all together. I mean, so it's hundreds of folks signing this thing. Sorry, go ahead with the letter.
Yeah, sure. So it was written really out of concern with Canada's complicity with Israel creating the conditions for mass starvation in Gaza. It's really focused on, really condemning the whole of the government of Canada's response to this entire, what is a genocide, as we know, in Palestine, and the impunity accorded to Israel carrying out these war crimes, these genocidal, campaign, and specifically focused on, the real destruction of food sovereignty, as well as the obstruction of humanitarian aid into Gaza. So that was the focus of the letter. I can go into more details on that if needed.
So that's the focus of the letter. It gets sent in. When these things get sent in, do you hear it? Did you get anything back on it? Does it generate conversation? What happens?
You know, not from the government, and I think this is a real, issue we have these days. It's not just, I mean, we are one of many, many, many groups and many groups of experts in healthcare, in food systems, et cetera, at the United Nations level, who have really been trying to compel the government, Prime Minister Carney, Foreign Affairs Minister Anand, to act. And what's really concerning is that they've not taken any material actions to end what's happening in Gaza. And so, yeah, we didn't hear back yet. But importantly, we also sent a letter by email to all of the MPs who were elected to Parliament after they signed the Vote Palestine campaign endorsement. And interestingly, we haven't heard back from them, except this morning, actually, I did hear back from Faraz al-Suad, who is a Palestinian member of Parliament, and here in Canada, Palestinian Canadian here in Canada. And he's been the only one, and it was only this morning that we heard back from. I do want to say, though, you received this from myself and you recognized my name, but we sent this across Canada to many, many media outlets, and the role of media in this issue, specifically in the genocide and the complicity of genocide on behalf of both the media and the Canadian government, is really crucial. And we saw it reflected in, some local CBC outlets picked it up, yourself, and in Thunder Bay. But it's really a crime in itself that the media is not trying to, or is not really engaging its duty to focus on this issue, which has been, repeated not just by, ourselves. In this letter, we mention, the killing of so many journalists in Gaza, and, silence really on behalf of much of the mainstream media in Canada. Of course, we have outlets who independently are reporting on these issues. But yeah, on the lack of response, I would say no from the government, which is it's expected, I think, but also from mainstream media, which is extremely concerning and should be a concern of, I think, all Canadians.
Professor Heidi Janes, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for getting in touch and coming on to talk on the show, as always.
Sure. Thanks, Adam.
Cheers. Heidi Janes there, a PhD student, Department of Political Science, University of Victoria. And Heidi Janes mentioned the deaths of journalists. So as of September 16th, 2025, so this year, the Committee to Protect Journalists' preliminary investigations showed at least 201 journalists and media workers were among the more than the tens of thousands killed in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and Lebanon since the Israel-Gaza war began, making it the deadliest period for journalists since CPJ began gathering data in 1992. So we're talking about the Middle East, right? Justin, I'll go to you on this.
Sure.
The part where I started there, the Commission of Inquiry in Geneva concluding that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza, and to say as well, like Israel has repeatedly denied committing genocide, and recently calling growing international condemnation a global campaign of lies, right? So this is where we are for what the Israeli government's saying, but now you've got this from the UN. And also growing calls from human rights groups and everyone else. So just wondering your thoughts on all this and where we are. And it's a lot, right? There's a lot to talk about. We can spend days talking about it, to be honest.
Absolutely. Look, this is going to sound callous, perhaps. Yep. It's certainly going to sound blunt. The sad reality is it's not going to change anything. Yeah, I think. At least that's how I feel about what has happened in terms of the UN's recognition of what they've termed a genocide in Gaza. Israel has shown repeatedly, not only in its responses to international condemnation, resolutions, criticisms, etc., quite frankly, that they don't care. Yeah. Rightly or wrongly. Sometimes I think they've been right. Sometimes I think they've been wrong. But I don't think this is going to fundamentally change the way that Israel continues to prosecute its war in Gaza, or frankly, who it listens to or doesn't listen to. I mean, the only state it really listens to, and it doesn't even always do this, is the United States. The United States, for example, with the strikes that took place on September 9th in Doha targeting the Hamas negotiating team in Qatar, the United States was supposedly, apparently, quite clear that they didn't want that strike to take place. Even within the Israeli decision-making apparatus, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Israel Defense Forces, did not support the strike. But the government of Benjamin Netanyahu decided to strike anyways. This is less the case, I think, of a rogue state, which some people have sometimes described Israel as right now, and more the case of, at times, a rogue prime minister and a rogue government than a rogue state. There's very clear checks and balances in Israel about what can and cannot be done on the battlefield. There's very clear checks and balances that separate the power between the prime minister's office and the army and the intelligence community and these kinds of things. But what we're seeing here now is a real reversal of the trend to include in the decision-making process in Israel, seriously include the positions of people like the head of the Mossad, Israeli foreign intelligence, the head of Shin Bet, the head of domestic intelligence, the head of the army, and Benjamin Netanyahu and his smaller decision-making team and his security cabinet are the ones that are making the decisions. And rightly or wrongly, Israeli law, as most law in Western democratic liberal countries have it, the army is responsible to the government. It's not the other way around. So Ayal Zamir, the lieutenant general, the head of the IDF, can say, we don't think we should be invading Gaza, which is really quite stunning for the head of the armed forces to say and then have to go do it, a week later. He can say the focus should be on the hostages. He can say we shouldn't have struck in Doha, but ultimately it's not his decision. The comments that Heidi made about Canada, look, this is a very difficult conversation to have. I think Canada and some other Western states as well, France, Britain, let's say, the three states there who are anticipated to recognize Palestinian statehood at the end of this month. I think some of those states are coming under a certain amount of criticism that I would suggest I'm going to say I think is unfair. I'm not entirely sure what some people want these states to do. I mean, it does in some respects go back to the conversation we're having about the power, the authority, the decision-making capacity of some of these international organizations. There's nothing Mark Carney can say, and he's already said that he's used the term genocide. There's nothing Mark Carney can say, and frankly, nothing Mark Carney can do or the Canadian government can do to stop what's going on. The Canadian government has a hard enough time figuring out issues in our own backyard, let alone getting a foreign state to stop a war. Now, could you say they could be stepping up more humanitarian aid? Perhaps. That is a convoluted logistical process that
there's issues with the airdrops as well, and so it's like the thing is, you don't have Western journalists on the ground in Gaza. The journalists who are there are being killed, right? Like we just talked about, over 200 are dead. So the information is not getting out. You're wondering about the involvement, and we've been talking this whole show about the United Nations and next week. And like if countries and the reaction can't change something, and then if the UN coming together, what hope is there to prevent any amount of like if all of a sudden it does, like with all of this pressure and like you say, like the United Nations Commission of Inquiry in Geneva concluding that Israel did commit genocide, and if this gets more widely accepted right from that, then what? So are there no mechanisms? Well,
you need a fundamental rethink of how the United Nations and peacekeeping and or peacemaking works. I mean, the United Nations is not a peacemaking organization.
No, exactly, right? They've had peacekeepers over the years, but they don't go in and enforce it.
Peacekeepers have to be invited in by the host community. It's a voluntary request that's made for the United States.
It's also an ad hoc.
That's right.
Dealing with a specific problem, peacekeeping it's not part of what the UN was originally.
That's right. So, what the sense that I often get from a lot of people who I speak to is a misunderstanding, we'll say, of what the United Nations is either meant to do or even capable of doing, right? And look, that's a conversation we can have. Should the United Nations play a more direct, proactive role in intervening in some of these conflicts? that has its own drawbacks as well when you're talking about peacemaking, right? I mean, if you're going to send a peacemaking force into an area in which it is not wanted, this often happened almost in Yugoslavia in the 1990s when NATO forces and then later UN peacekeeping forces were not wanted in certain areas and sometimes did come under fire from Serbian army forces. You're changing the calculus of the whole game. I mean, it also potentially risks widening any conflict.
Yeah, and what is China going to think about? Like when you look at the UN Security Council, and
Sure.
And I'm just acknowledging the complexities of this, right? Luke, what about you?
Yeah, I was just thinking on this that one of the things, because this follows on from the International Association of Genocide Scholars also saying genocide. There's a new report out from B'Tselem, the Israeli Info Center on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, which is called Our Genocide. But other organizations too. Médecins Sans Frontières called it genocide. Lemke Institute of Genocide Prevention has, International Federation for Human Rights, Troika, the Irish aid agency, Oxfam, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. Yeah. There's a long list. I think what we're seeing there, and I think a scholar in humanitarian law even put it this way, that we're seeing an emerging consensus that this is likely to be genocide. We won't get to the position really of saying, legally for sure until the ICJ, which is, again...
because it comes down to intent, right?
It comes down to intent, yeah. But, we are seeing an emerging consensus. So, on the one hand, I think, this is a major change. On the other hand, though, in some respects, the question of saying, is it genocide or is it not, is secondary to the fact that actually we do have a famine there.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. We do have breaches of rules of war, breaches of humanitarian law, and of course, we've two former Israeli prime ministers have actually come out to say this. And I remember one Israeli former official saying, and this was a few years back, if even a quarter of the stories coming out are true, Israel's in trouble, that there is. And I think what we're going to see here directly, even though, of course, it's the United States that's the key player here, we're going to see a drop in support. We've already seen the Spanish prime minister saying we need to ban Israel from sporting events. There's big debate now over Eurovision. And countries refusing to take part if Israel takes part. So we're moving to a situation where we saw sort of the height of apartheid with international reactions. And I'd actually be interested in Justin's comments on, again, it's not something I know a hell of a lot about, but of course there has been the Arab Islamic Summit in Doha, which was called because of the strike. And there have been talk about, quite a strong resolution, but didn't seem to have any teeth to it. So there's a debate about what's happening with that and with the Abraham Accords. And I think
we've got about 3 minutes left.
Yeah, more knowledge on that.
The Arab states are in a particularly challenging position as well, because the trend obviously since the Abraham Accords in 2020 has been towards regional integration, something that the United States also supports. And in particular, this president, Donald Trump, really supports. I mean, he wants to be the one that signs some deals of the century, right? Some landmark agreements that normalizes relations between Israel and the Saudis, for example, and then more dominoes may fall. Reports this week as well are suggesting Israel is quite close to a new security agreement with Syria. And it's those kinds of agreements that usually lead to broader ones later on once they agree on, just what kind of domestic and regional security looks like. It's a tricky one for the Arab states because they're really caught between this impulse to integrate Israel economically and politically into the region. It is arguably the region's most dynamic economy, and Arab states don't want to pass that opportunity up. But they have to balance that against what is often public opinion in their own countries, which is usually quite anti-Israeli, and certainly so since 2023 and the start of this particular conflict. They have sovereignty issues to worry about at times, as we saw on September 9 with the strikes in Doha, Qatar. So the Arab states are in a very, very tricky position. Can the Arab states compel Israel to do anything? The short answer is no. Israel's a military superpower. Israel will do as it wants in the region. But this week as well, there is interesting traction on the Tony Blair Institute's proposal for peace in the region, which includes a wide body of Arab political representatives and a military force going into Gaza and administering it politically until the PA, the Palestinian Authority, can take over.
Okay. 20 seconds left. What are you watching for next week? Like 10 seconds each. What's the one thing you're looking for? at the UN General Assembly you want to see?
Yeah. What I want to see in that? Oh my
Progress.
God. I can't do it in that small amount of time. Hope.
Yeah, there you go. Justin?
If Benjamin Netanyahu can explain how Israel will become a super Sparta, as he said, and give us a little clarity on
what
how
that
this
means.
isolation is going to look.
All right, guys, thank you so much, as always, for this.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, that's it for the show today. If you have thoughts for us, The Signal at cbc.ca. Call the Signal line and leave a message, 709-576-5260. Tomorrow, something completely different. Boost in the local economy, one vendor at a time. Since the beginning of September, Quadrangle NL has launched a marketplace at the Avalon Mall representing folks from the queer community. Our conversation will focus on how supporting entrepreneurs helps everyone involved for the economy and local communities. Thanks for listening today. Don't miss the show tomorrow. Cheers.